Thank you for joining today on Ministers and Clergy Tax Rules. We're going to go ahead and dive in. You're welcome to read a little bit about me if you wish, but the main part of what we want to get through, because we have so much to cover in this course, is all these little, I guess you could say, goals that we're going to be covering for today. We first do have to start out with a little bit of some basics to define, by IRS standards, minister or clergy, to talk about minister income and define that a little more specifically, and also talk about what should be included on a W-2 since it's a little different than our average W-2s. We're going to go into the housing allowance and look at some special expense considerations that we have to worry about as it relates to expenses. And then last and certainly not least, the exemption and the Form 4361 and how this relates to our topic for today. So diving right in, we're first going to have to stop and take a step back and say we got to at least define who is in this category. If we talk about a minister or a clergy member, who exactly is in this category? We're also going to, so you know, as we go, we're going to kind of show you where the information needs to be entered on forms, but a lot of this is more conceptual. So if we say, okay, how does IRS define a minister or a clergy member? It's in regulations. If you want to look those up, I went ahead and put the references there for you. But basically, a qualified minister is somebody who is duly ordained, commissioned, or licensed, and by a recognized church or religious order. Not only do they have to be commissioned or licensed by a recognized church, but they also have to be actually performing ministerial duties. So that could be, for example, conducting worship or teaching, maybe a form of administration, or other functions that could be ceremonies or baptisms, weddings, funerals, something similar. To go a little bit more into that, so there's a lot of ands. It's not just a or. Each one of these kind of adds into the previous part of the definition. The person is performing services for religious organizations or integral agencies. Theological institutions. So they could be performing a ministerial function for a theological institution, and that would qualify as well. They could be performing services for the government, including the U.S., or states or political subdivisions, except there's a specific exclusion that if they're a chaplain of the armed services, they are not considered a minister or clergy and fall under these rules. They're actually considered a commissioned officer instead. So those would be falling out of the rules or the definition. So just to give you a little bit more in this, if you look at a lot of this, is we get things at the IRS level and they define it, and then the courts come along and kind of help us define it a little bit more. They have indicated that this was more, all these definitions, the purpose of the requirement is to exclude self-appointed ministers, and it's not really intended to limit benefits only to the ordained. So this was more that they created this very complex and lengthy definition to try to exclude out those that were self-appointed. So some examples of that, there's been court cases where somebody has basically, I think the case of the Gardeners was most notable. They created their own church, transferred all their assets to the church, and then they claimed a vow of poverty and had the church pay for their expenses. But then they traveled the country and promoted their services to others to set up similar church structure and sold books on the subject, and of course deposited the money, for those services into the church account as well. So as you can imagine, it really didn't turn out well for them, and they are spending their time now exercising their vow of poverty in the federal pen. But this is kind of where the definition starts getting, very specific, because they want to try to rule out those who are just self-appointed and they've created their own church, and then they say, oh yeah, I'm under these rules too because, I'm a minister of that church. So that's why there is these three categories, you can say. I'm going to back up one slide. So to say they're qualified minister because they are, duly ordained, and it's by a recognized church, and they're actually performing ministerial duties, and that those services are performed for a religious organization or a specific, government or theological institution. So that's the reason for the definitions, and that's the kind of our groundwork or our building blocks, is just to make sure, okay, does that fall in this category? And for the purposes of this course too, I know there are a lot of different ways that we can define, clergy or minister, and there's a lot of different titles, but just to make it simple, I'm going to pretty much in this course just refer to them as minister or clergy. So that's really to be all-inclusive in the terminology. So we have to now say, okay, we got a feel for maybe who could qualify within this category. But beyond that, now, how do we define their income? So we're going to look now at their income and say, in the case of a minister, their income is supposed to be, in most cases, reported on a W-2. There's actually very few exceptions where it wouldn't be. One of those exceptions would be in the case of a traveling evangelist. They're not paid by a specific church because they're paid by many different ones. They're traveling to one a week, possibly. They would get a 1099 miscellaneous, and that could be appropriate in their particular case, but for most every other one we're talking about, they should be getting their income reported on a W-2. And that's unfortunately reported quite often incorrectly by churches. So this is one of our first things that we have to kind of, I guess, raise our awareness and know what it should look like so that we can help to correct it if need be. But this is a common error that I have seen time and time again. If we look at true non-W-2 income, what does that look like? Well, they can sometimes get paid for services that's not included in their salary, and that's certainly possible. They might go and perform a wedding or a funeral and they get some money for that. Well, that's non-W-2 income. The mistake here, unfortunately, is that they will commonly want to refer to that as a gift. And they say, oh yeah, that was just, a gift. Well, unfortunately, it doesn't qualify. If service is performed, it's not a gift. It's actually taxable income, according to IRS rules. All of that is reportable on a Schedule C. It's truly just like any other type of business. If you're performing services and you're paid for it, that's taxable income and it's reportable on a Schedule C. So let's look at that little bit of a topic, gift versus compensation. This is often what they want to say, it's a gift. It's a gift. No, it's a factual question is what they define that in under the Internal Revenue Code. And in this case, the taxpayer is the one that bears that burden of proof. The most important factor when you're trying to say, is this really a gift or is this compensation, is intent. The intent of the donor, in essence. Was this for, performing a wedding? Was that, for just a random, here, I want to give you this gift out of the blue for no reason whatsoever? There is a difference between the two. You have to also be careful. In a lot of churches, they may take special collections for that pastor. And this is what you have to be careful of, because if it's organized and it's a special occasion day, then it's really not a gift. It still is. Just as if it was any other day where they're getting compensation, a special collection falls under that category as well. But bottom line, gifts are supposed to be random. They're not connected in any way to a service performed. Those special collections are kind of tricky in that sense because it's not really necessarily random. But if there is a total random gift, it is possible it can be treated as a gift. There is one little exception in this. There's a lot of exceptions in tax law, isn't there? But in this case, the funds are paid to a minister at or very near the time of retirement. They actually are considered a gift and not compensation. So it depends on timing too. Most all their life they're trucking along. It may be compensation all through everything they do in their time until they get close to retirement. Maybe that can go ahead and be considered a gift. So there is, if you were curious, there's a revenue ruling that addresses that specific fact there.